Sometimes the quietest lives leave the loudest echoes. Long before the war, long before the trains, the yellow stars, and the death marches, there was a boy born into a world that expected very little from him. Raoul Wallenberg arrived in 1912 Stockholm, into wealth, prestige, and the expectation of a comfortable, uneventful life. His family was old banking blood. The Wallenbergs were known in every Swedish circle of influence. But Raoul was different. He wasn't born into legacy. He was born into loss. His father, a naval officer, died of cancer before he could even hold his son. Raoul grew up hearing stories, not voices. His mother remarried, and though she loved her boy fiercely, the shadow of what was missing hung over their home. He wasn't raised in hardship, but he knew absence. And from that absence grew something surprising, a kind of emotional sensitivity that stuck out in the polished, status-conscious Wallenberg family. Raoul was the boy who watched people, not just in passing, but deeply. He read faces like they were novels, listened to silences as if they were sentences. Where others looked past suffering, he looked into it. He didn't follow the family path. Law, banking, high diplomacy, none of it held his heart. Instead, he studied architecture. That choice seemed like a detour at the time, something softer, quieter than what the Wallenbergs were known for. But design is about protection. Architecture is about creating spaces where people can live, breathe, and feel safe. Raoul never stopped designing those spaces. He just didn't use bricks and mortar when it mattered most. In his early 20s, he traveled. Palestine, South Africa, France, the United States. He saw the frayed edges of Europe as fascism began to stir. He watched anti-Semitism unfold not as history, but as headlines. His time in Haifa, working alongside Jewish laborers, left an imprint. He didn't just shake hands, he listened. When he returned to Sweden, he came back with something his privileged world rarely handed out: perspective. Sweden in the 1930s was neutral, quiet, diplomatic. It played its cards close to the chest while the rest of the continent slipped into flame. But Raoul couldn't ignore the temperature rising beyond its borders. His curiosity led him into business, not a natural fit, but it put him in proximity to Hungarian Jew Laszlo Szombat-Falvy, who would become a key figure in Raoul's life. Through him, Raoul learned about the maze of immigration laws choking European Jews, about the desperation that came when there were no more borders left to flee to. It wasn't yet clear what kind of man Raoul Wallenberg would be. He was restless, intelligent, a little impulsive, charming but unpretentious, educated but unorthodox. His life seemed to drift between paths, guided less by ambition and more by instinct. What no one knew, not even Raoul himself, was that the world would soon collapse into a nightmare, and that his peculiar mix of empathy, courage, and audacity would place him at the center of one of the greatest rescue missions history has ever recorded. But that was still ahead. For now, there was still quiet. There was still time. The young man who would soon face down Adolf Eichmann's death squads, who would snatch lives from under boots of the SS, who would disappear into the frozen jaws of the Soviet Union. For now, he was just Raoul, not a hero, not yet. And in a continent sleepwalking into genocide, the countdown had already begun. By 1944, most of Europe had already been soaked in blood. The ghettos of Warsaw had burned. The gas chambers of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz had devoured entire cities' worth of people. Millions were gone, and still the machine turned. Hungary had remained an uneasy ally to Germany, a country trapped between fear and survival. Its Jews, hundreds of thousands, had, for the most part, been spared from the fate of their counterparts in Poland or Ukraine. But that changed in March 1944. Germany invaded. Occupation was swift. The final solution arrived in Budapest with Liszt's cattle cars and cold precision. Adolf Eichmann himself, the architect of logistical genocide, came to oversee the operation. Within weeks, the machinery of death shifted into high gear. In the countryside, entire Jewish communities were wiped out. People were herded like animals, packed into boxcars with no food, water, or air, bound for Auschwitz. In just 2 months, over 400,000 Jews vanished. The Swedish legation in Budapest had only a few diplomats and almost no leverage. But behind the scenes, there were those trying to do something, anything, to slow the tide. And someone needed to go in. Not just a diplomat, but someone who could blend formality with fearlessness. Someone persuasive enough to face Nazi officers and walk out alive. The United States War Refugee Board, recently created under mounting pressure to intervene in the Holocaust, worked with Swedish authorities and others to find that someone. They chose Raoul Wallenberg. At first glance, it didn't make sense. He had no formal diplomatic background. He was young, untested, and a bit unconventional. But that was exactly why it would work. Wallenberg didn't think like a bureaucrat. He wasn't bound by protocol. He understood risk, and more importantly, he was willing to take it. What they were sending him into wasn't diplomacy. It was war. He arrived in Budapest in July 1944. The city was suffocating. German troops and Hungarian Arrow-Cross fascists patrolled the streets. Jews were being rounded up daily, forced to wear yellow stars, shoved into ghettos, loaded onto trains. Fear ran through every alley. Hope was a rumor, but Wallenberg didn't flinch. Within days, he began issuing Schutzpasses, documents printed on blue and yellow Swedish paper, stamped with official seals and forged legalese, declaring the bearer to be under protection of the Swedish crown. These weren't real passports, not legally binding in any international sense. But Wallenberg wielded them like shields, waving them in front of machine guns and death squads, using the illusion of authority like armor. He rented dozens of buildings and declared them Swedish territory. He hoisted flags, plastered signs, posted guards, and filled it with hundreds then thousands of desperate people. He called them safe houses, and somehow, impossibly, the Nazis respected them. Maybe they feared diplomatic retaliation. Maybe they underestimated him. Or maybe, just maybe, Wallenberg's sheer audacity left them unsure of how to react. This wasn't quiet work. Wallenberg showed up at train stations, climbed onto boxcars, shouted names, handed out passports, dragged people off trains with Nazi guns pointed at his back. He talked fast, moved faster, and didn't wait for permission. He knew that hesitation was death. He knew that fear had no place here. Each forged paper, each forged stamp, each rescued name was a tiny revolt against the machinery of genocide. But it wasn't enough. Every night, more were taken. Every morning, the ghettos shrank. Wallenberg didn't sleep. He couldn't. The weight of it all pressed down. The screams in the distance, the faces that disappeared, the families he couldn't save. Yet he never stopped moving. Because in Budapest, in 1944, movement was life. No one quite understood how far he was willing to go. Not yet, but he was only getting started. By late 1944, the city of Budapest was choking on fear. The Germans knew the war was turning. The Russians were pressing in from the east. The Americans were bombing from above. But instead of retreating, the Nazis accelerated. If they were going to lose the war, they would at least try to win the genocide. And Eichmann made it personal. He ordered the deportation of the last remaining Hungarian Jews, the ones in Budapest. No trains left. Rail lines had been bombed. So the method changed. Now, Jews were to be marched. Hundreds of kilometers. On foot. In winter. These weren't just forced relocations. They were executions in slow motion. Thousands were marched west toward Austria. Men, women, children. No coats. No food. No shoes in many cases. Just bodies pushed forward at gunpoint, collapsing in ditches, shot if they slowed. These were called the death marches. And they were exactly that, a deliberate method of extermination without gas or camps. Just hunger, frost, and exhaustion. And into this walked Raoul Wallenberg. He wasn't invited. He wasn't welcome. But there he was, a Swedish diplomat driving out into the countryside with a caravan of cars, each one flying Swedish flags. He found the marches, pulled up beside them, and began doing the unthinkable. He shouted names, held up bundles of Schutzpasses, told Nazi officers that these people were under Swedish protection, that they had paperwork, that they were being mistakenly deported. It was a lie, but a bold one. And sometimes the bluff worked. He would grab hands, yanked people from the lines, shoved them into his car before the Germans could object. There are accounts of him walking up to guards mid-march, completely exposed, demanding the release of prisoners. Sometimes he handed out food. Sometimes he argued until they let a few go. Sometimes he stared down the barrels of rifles. But he always came back. It was madness. It was reckless. It was working. At one point, he created false census lists of Swedish citizens in Budapest, numbering the thousands, to prevent Jews from being rounded up. He paid bribes, threatened lawsuits, delivered letters to Eichmann's staff accusing them of war crimes. In one infamous incident, he confronted a Nazi officer in the middle of a death march, locked eyes with him, and calmly said, "You can shoot me if you want, but after the war, you'll be hanged for this." The man backed down. Wallenberg had no army, no weapons, no diplomatic immunity that meant anything on those roads. But what he did have was presence, a strange, unshakable confidence that made men with guns hesitate. He dressed sharply, always in a suit. He looked like order in the middle of chaos. And more importantly, he refused to act like he was afraid, even when he was. Behind him, his network of safe houses and collaborators kept growing. Doctors, clergy, volunteers, they kept the machinery of salvation running in the shadows. But Wallenberg was the face, the force, the one who would not stop knocking on doors, tearing people off trains, slipping life back into hands already reaching for death. Each act wasn't just a rescue. It was defiance. A single man standing between annihilation and survival, one forged paper at a time. But this was more than bravery. This was obsession. Wallenberg no longer had a personal life. He barely ate. He barely slept. He kept moving. Because he knew the moment he stopped, they would win. In Budapest's final months under German control, he was said to be responsible for saving tens of thousands. His numbers are debated, but the truth isn't. There were thousands of people alive who should have been ash. And they were breathing because one man refused to look away. And yet, all of it was fragile. The war was closing in, and as the Soviets neared Budapest, a new threat was about to swallow Wallenberg whole. By January 1945, Budapest was a battlefield. The Soviets had surrounded the city. Bombs fell day and night. Streets were rubble, bodies frozen in gutters. Smoke curling up from entire blocks turned to ash. But inside that chaos, in those last weeks before the end, Raoul Wallenberg kept working. He'd turned entire buildings into sanctuaries. The Swedish safe houses were barely habitable, overcrowded, cold, running out of food, but they were alive. Every hallway echoed with whispered prayers. Every room held the terrified hope of people waiting for either salvation or betrayal. And every single one of them had placed their lives in the hands of this one man who now moved through the city like a ghost. He slept in different places each night. The arrow-crossed fascists had him on their list. There were assassination attempts. He was being hunted. But he kept moving, kept organizing, kept bluffing and bribing and forging. The Hungarian death squads were losing control of the city. And in that window of confusion, Raoul made his final, most desperate push. He began issuing even more protection letters. He ordered medical care for the sick. He negotiated directly with high-level Nazis, men who had already sentenced thousands to death, and somehow still walked out of their offices alive. And then the Soviets arrived. They didn't come as liberators. They came as conquerors. To them, anyone who had interacted with Nazi or Axis-controlled structures was suspect. Diplomats, businessmen, even rescuers. Especially rescuers. The kind who worked in the gray areas, who carried forged documents, who spoke too many languages and made too many people listen. On January 17th, 1945, Raoul Wallenberg got into a Soviet car. He had requested a meeting with Marshal Malinovsky, one of the Red Army's top commanders, reportedly to discuss rebuilding the city and protecting the survivors he had just risked everything to save. He never made it to that meeting. Or if he did, nothing came of it. Raoul Wallenberg vanished. The Soviets claimed they took him for protective custody. Then they said they didn't know what happened. Then they said he died in a car crash. Then they said he never entered their custody at all. Then they said he was in Moscow. Then they denied it again. What we now know, after decades of lies and silence, is that Wallenberg was taken to Lubyanka prison in Moscow, held in isolation, interrogated. Why? No one can say for sure. Theories range from mistaken espionage charges to Stalin's paranoia about Western interference. He was accused of being a spy, despite his mission being entirely humanitarian. Some believe he died in 1947, possibly executed. Some say he lived longer, surviving in the gulag system, passed from prison to prison, slowly crushed under the weight of secrecy. There were reports, testimonies, hints. A prisoner matching his description here. A man who spoke fluent Swedish there. A letter, a whisper, a rumor, but no confirmation. No body, no last words. Raoul Wallenberg, the man who had yanked children off trains bound for Auschwitz, who had stared down SS officers and arrow-crossed thugs, who had rewritten the meaning of what one human life could do, was swallowed by the very system he had tried to fight. A different system, but just as merciless. His mother searched for him until the day she died. So did his stepfather. So did human rights groups, politicians, diplomats, journalists. None succeeded. And yet, while he was disappearing into silence, something strange began to happen. The people he had saved began to speak. In the decades after the war, long after the guns had quieted and the empires redrawn their maps, voices began to rise. Survivors, children, grandchildren, people who should not have existed, and knew it, people whose names had once appeared on a scrap of blue and yellow paper, stamped with forged seal, handed to them by a stranger in a suit, standing in front of a train that was supposed to take them to their death. One by one, they began to speak. In testimonies, in documentaries, in letters and interviews, they told a story that no longer belonged only to history books. It belonged to them, to their families, their memories, their lives. They remembered him not as a myth, but as a man. They remembered the tall Swede with piercing eyes, who moved through Budapest like he had 1,000 invisible soldiers at his back, who showed up at checkpoints with lists of names, some real, some invented, demanding that prisoners be released, who barged into holding camps hours before trains were set to leave, waving passports like weapons, arguing until he wore the guards down or scared them off. They remembered how he never raised his voice, but always commanded the room, how he walked straight into the jaws of death, not because he thought he couldn't die, but because he knew what happened if he didn't. One woman recalled hiding in a basement with her mother, days away from starvation, when Wallenberg's team arrived with food and blankets. He didn't even look tired, she said, but we were all exhausted. It was as if he had decided that his body didn't matter anymore. Another told of how, after being pulled off a train by Wallenberg, she saw him go back to the same train, looking for more people to save. He didn't stop at me, she said. He kept going. That's what I remember most. He didn't stop. There were stories of him climbing into cattle cars, pulling people out physically, yelling in German and Hungarian and Swedish. There were stories of him bribing officers with gold, food, watches, anything he could get. Stories of him showing up in the dead of night to deliver forged documents. Stories of him saving entire families by simply showing up at the right moment with a name, a list, a badge, a threat. But the numbers are where the scale becomes almost incomprehensible. Estimates vary, but at least 20,000 Jews were issued Schutz passes directly through his efforts. More were hidden in the 30-odd safe houses he operated under the Swedish flag. Some say the number of lives he saved reached 100,000. And while no single number can ever fully be verified, because chaos doesn't keep neat records, one fact is indisputable. In the final month of the Holocaust, when Hungary became the Nazis' last major killing field, Raoul Wallenberg was a firewall. He stood between life and death. Again and again, his operation was not a one-man show. He had help, brave collaborators, typists, doctors, priests, locals who risked their lives. But he was the center, the catalyst, the one who kept pushing when others said it was too late. The man who turned a job into a mission and a mission into a legacy. And that legacy isn't just numbers. It's voices. It's the descendants of those he saved. Tens of thousands of lives that stretch forward into today, tomorrow, Generations untouched by gas chambers and firing squads because one man refused to look away. There's a photograph taken years later at a ceremony honoring his memory. It shows an elderly woman holding the hand of her grandson. She's smiling. He's waving. They are alive because Raoul Wallenberg once stood between a child and a soldier. This is the scale of what he did. Not in medals, not in monuments, in people. The war ended. The camps were liberated. The trials began. Names like Eichmann and Himmler became synonymous with death. New governments formed, borders shifted, cities rebuilt. But one name, the name that had once whispered hope through the alleyways of Budapest, vanished like smoke. Raoul Wallenberg did not return. For a time, there was disbelief. A man so visible, so forceful, so impossible to ignore, couldn't just disappear. Maybe he was still in Moscow. Maybe he was negotiating something important. Maybe he was caught in red tape. Just another pawn in a post-war bureaucracy of suspicion. Maybe. But time has a way of turning maybes into silence. His family begged for answers. The Swedish government made inquiries, half-hearted at first, cautious, perhaps reluctant to provoke the Soviet Union. The Cold War was settling in like frost, and Sweden, proudly neutral, delicately diplomatic, didn't press too hard. They asked questions. The Soviets replied with denial, then confusion, then lies. In 1957, 12 years after his disappearance, the Soviets finally admitted that Wallenberg had been in their custody and that he had died in 1947 of a heart attack. No body, no records, just a typed statement. The heart attack story unraveled almost immediately, but it didn't matter. They weren't going to say anything more. And Sweden shamefully accepted it. His family never did. His half-brother, Guy von Dardel, spent decades fighting to uncover the truth. He traveled to Russia, met with former prisoners, combed through archives, begged officials. He found whispers. Inmates who claimed to have seen a foreign diplomat in the gulag. Guards who recalled a Swedish man asking for contact with his embassy. There were notes, descriptions, clues, but never confirmation. Never enough to force the truth out of the Kremlin. Some say he was executed. Others think he was kept alive for years, maybe even decades, moved from prison to prison, forgotten by history, but remembered by those he saved. The tragedy of Raoul Wallenberg is not just that he died, it's that he was lost. Forgotten not by those who owed him their lives, never by them, but by governments, by politics, by the very systems he had outwitted to save others. He gave everything, risked everything, for people he didn't know. And when it was his turn to be saved, no one came. It would take until the year 2055 years after his disappearance for Sweden to officially declare him dead. But even then, they admitted there is no proof, only absence. And still, the questions remain. Why would the Soviets arrest him at all? Why not release him? Make him a symbol of anti-Nazi resistance? Why imprison the man who had saved so many from Germany's Holocaust? Some believe Stalin saw in him what the Nazis had seen, a threat. Wallenberg was too smart, too brave, too capable. He knew how to manipulate fear, how to get results. Maybe the Soviets didn't trust that kind of power in someone they couldn't control. Or maybe, in the chaos of post-war politics, he became a victim of the same machine he had once defied, a man caught between giants, trampled underfoot. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Silence. But silence is a strange thing. Over time, it doesn't always erase. Sometimes it amplifies. And in the decades that followed, as new generations looked back at the war and its wounds, Raoul Wallenberg's name began to rise again. Not just as a hero, but as a question, a mirror, a reminder of what is possible when one person stands up and of what happens when the world looks away. There are names in history that echo because of power. Kings, conquerors, politicians. And then there are names that echo because of presence. Not the kind that rules, but the kind that refuses to vanish. Raoul Wallenberg became the latter. He didn't return. He never gave a final speech, never wrote a memoir, never stood on a stage to explain why he did what he did. His story ends not with conclusion, but with a vanishing point. And yet, somehow, it became one of the most enduring moral beacons of the 20th century. The survivors carried him forward. They wrote books, spoke at schools, stood at podiums, and whispered his name into microphones decades after the fact. They didn't do it to glorify him. They did it because they couldn't forget him. Because in their memories, he wasn't just a rescuer. He was the moment when death blinked first. And slowly, the world began to listen. Monuments rose. In Budapest, statues of Wallenberg holding Schutz passes stand not far from where the arrow crossed one-shot people into the Danube. In Israel, he is honored at Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among the nations. He has streets named after him in cities that span continents: New York, Moscow, Buenos Aires, Tel Aviv. There are schools, parks, foundations. His face has appeared on stamps. His story taught in classrooms, his name invoked in parliamentary halls. But none of that quite captures why he matters. Because Raoul Wallenberg is not remembered simply because he was brave. History has no shortage of brave men. He's remembered because he chose to be brave at a time when doing so meant isolation, risk, disappearance. He made a decision that most people never have to make, to spend his life so others wouldn't lose theirs. And he didn't just save the innocent. He exposed the cowardice of the powerful. With forged paper and borrowed authority, he held back a death machine that had already devoured millions. And in doing so, he forced the world to confront its own excuses. I didn't know. I couldn't do anything. I was afraid. Raoul heard those same reasons. And he did it anyway. He reminds us that courage is not a lightning bolt. It's a choice made again and again, often in silence, often without applause. And that's why his legacy endures. Not because he lived long enough to see it, but because he acted in a way that made remembering him a moral obligation. In 1981, the United States Congress made Wallenberg an honorary American citizen, one of only a handful in history. In Canada, he is a national hero. In Sweden, he is now studied as both a symbol of national pride and painful accountability. His story is used to teach human rights, moral courage, ethics under pressure, not as history, as warning. But perhaps his greatest legacy doesn't lie in the tributes or the statues. It lies in the questions he left behind. What would I have done in his place? Would I have handed out passports in the face of rifles? Would I have walked into a death march with no weapon but paper and will? Would I have risked everything for someone I didn't know? Raoul Wallenberg never asked to be a hero, but the world keeps asking about him, not just to remember him, but to measure itself against him. And that's the kind of memory that outlives monuments. There's a strange silence at the center of Raoul Wallenberg's story. A silence not caused by forgetting, but by absence. The absence of closure, of a grave, of a final sentence. We know how he lived. We know what he did. But we don't know how it ended. And maybe that's why his story won't. Because in the years since he stepped into that Soviet car, everything about the world has changed. The borders he once raced across are redrawn. The empires he fought against are gone. The cities he risked his life to protect have been rebuilt with glass and steel. And the survivors, the ones who clung to forged papers like lifelines, they're mostly gone now, too. But his silence remains. And if you listen closely, it's not empty. It asks us, what would you do if you knew the world was on fire and no one was coming? What would you give if the only thing standing between life and death was you? Wallenberg didn't save people because it was his job. He did it because it was unthinkable not to. He did it without a roadmap, without a backup plan, without certainty he would survive it. And he didn't. But that didn't make his mission a failure. It made it sacred. His life forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable truths. That courage is not always recognized. That sacrifice is not always rewarded. That some heroes die in silence, without statues or parades, and they still matter. Maybe even more. And perhaps the most haunting part of his story isn't what happened to him. It's how easily it could have been none of us ever heard his name. One different decision. One missed train. One forged document that didn't convince a guard. History is full of moments where the tide turns not because of grand armies or powerful speeches, but because someone ordinary refused to sit still. We often think of history as something made by governments and generals. But Raoul Wallenberg proved otherwise. He was one man. He had no army, no weapon, just paper, stamps, a sharp mind, and the stubborn refusal to let people die unnoticed. And that's what lives on, not just in the museums or memorials, but in every single person who steps forward instead of stepping back, in every quiet act of resistance, in every decision to see a stranger not as a burden, but as a life worth saving. Wallenberg was not a saint. He was not fearless. He was a man who chose to act again and again until there was nothing left of him to give. And in that choice, he left us a question that still matters today, maybe more than ever. In the face of cruelty, what will you do? That's the story. That's the silence. That's what remains. And if we keep telling it, if we keep passing it on, maybe one day that silence will not just be the sound of what we lost. Maybe it will become the space where courage grows again. The kind of courage that doesn't wait for applause. The kind that disappears without regret, knowing it left something behind. A name, a life, a legacy. Raoul Wallenberg. He saved tens of thousands. And he changed what one person can mean.